The sun had already slipped behind the mountains, leaving only a soft orange glow stretching across the sky. The wide Arizona plains had a way of turning quiet at night. The wind would calm, the dust would settle, and the world seemed to hold its breath. In that quiet corner of the Wild West, Thomas Whitaker stood on the porch of his ranch house looking out over his land. He had lived on that stretch of land for more than 10 years, ever since he was a young man. The ranch wasn't large by the standards of some men, but it was steady and honest. There were rows of wooden fences, 2 barns, a small corral, and the simple wooden house that he had built with his own hands. Thomas was a quiet man by nature. He had grown used to being alone. The neighbors were far away, and the nearest town took almost half a day to reach on horseback. But he liked it that way. Life out here followed a rhythm, the rising of the sun, the cry of the hawks, the lowing of cattle, and the stars that spread wide and bright at night. He worked hard every day and slept soundly every night. But that night, as he leaned against the porch post, he felt something in the air, a kind of stillness that was heavier than usual, as if the land itself was waiting for something. The early autumn chill had begun to set in. Thomas pulled his jacket closer around him. A few of the cows in the distance moved restlessly, their silhouettes faint against the fading light. He noticed it then, a sound, faint but clear, not the sound of an animal, not the soft wind, a creak from the barn door. Thomas straightened a little, his brow furrowing. He kept the door of the barn tied shut to keep the wind from swinging it open. That sound meant someone or something was in there. He didn't rush. That wasn't his way. He stepped down from the porch and crossed the yard slowly, his boots making soft, dull thuds against the packed dirt. The barn loomed in front of him, tall and quiet, its roof catching the last glimmers of light. A horse snorted softly inside, uneasy. He placed his hand on the wooden door and pushed it open just enough to peek through. The scent of hay filled the air. At first, all seemed normal. His old chestnut horse shifted in its stall. A few chickens were roosting in the corner. And then, in the shadowed corner near the hayloft, he saw a shape, a small shape, still and curled up. For a moment, Thomas thought it might be an animal. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw it clearly. A person, a young woman wrapped in an old blanket lying among the hay. Her dark hair fell across her face. Her clothes were torn in places, dusty, and her feet looked bare and bruised. Her chest rose and fell slowly. She was breathing, but she looked exhausted. Thomas felt a twist in his chest. It wasn't fear, but a mix of surprise and caution. People didn't just wander onto his land. It wasn't the kind of place someone accidentally found. And this woman, he could see by her long, straight black hair and the way she carried herself even in sleep, that she was Apache. He'd seen women like her before when passing near tribal lands or trading posts, but never this close. Never in his barn. He stepped inside quietly, careful not to startle her. His horse lifted its head and watched him as if asking questions too. The air was cool and smelled faintly of dust, leather, and hay. The woman stirred slightly, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders, though her eyes stayed closed. Thomas stopped a few steps away. He was not a man who liked trouble, and the West was full of it. Tensions between settlers and Apache people were a part of daily life, whether he liked it or not. He knew the stories that passed through town, the whispered warnings, the heated arguments in the saloon. But none of that mattered in that quiet barn. What he saw wasn't an enemy or a stranger. He saw someone tired, cold, and clearly in need of help. He thought about leaving her there and locking the door. He thought about riding to the sheriff in the morning, but none of those thoughts settled well in his mind. Instead, he reached for the lantern hanging by the door and lifted it carefully. The warm light spread through the barn, chasing away the shadows. It lit her face clearly for the first time. She was young, maybe no older than 20. Her cheeks were pale, but her features were strong and proud. She looked like someone who had walked far and carried a story no one else knew. Thomas placed the lantern down softly on a wooden crate. He didn't want to wake her roughly. Instead, he stepped back, leaned against a post, and let out a slow breath. The night was growing colder by the minute, and the barn wouldn't keep her warm enough for long. He had an extra blanket in the house, some bread and warm water on the stove. He told himself that he could give her those things, nothing more. Just a small kindness, and then she could be on her way when morning came. But as he turned to leave, the woman's eyes opened. They were dark, sharp, and alert. She didn't speak. She didn't move much either, but Thomas could feel the strength in her gaze. There was fear in her expression, but also something fierce, something that told him she was not someone used to begging for help. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. A man who had built his life in quiet, steady rhythms, and a woman who had walked into that silence carrying unknown miles behind her. Thomas raised his hands slowly, palms facing up, to show her he meant no harm. "You're safe here," he said softly. She didn't respond. She probably didn't understand much English, or maybe she simply didn't trust him yet. He couldn't blame her. Trust was a rare thing in those parts. He backed toward the door, pointing to himself, and then toward the house to show he was leaving. Before he stepped outside, he paused for a moment. The stars had fully taken the sky now, wide and clear. The wind had picked up a bit, carrying a dry, cold bite. He thought of her lying on the hay with only a thin blanket. It didn't sit right with him, so he went back to the house, his boots crunching softly in the dirt, and returned a few minutes later with a heavier wool blanket and a small tin cup of warm water. When he re-entered the barn, the woman was sitting up slightly, still wrapped in the old blanket. Her eyes followed his every movement. Slowly, Thomas placed the blanket near her and set the cup down within her reach, careful not to get too close. Then he stepped back. She hesitated but finally reached for the cup, sipping the warm water with both hands. She didn't thank him with words, but she didn't need to. The way her shoulders relaxed slightly was enough. Thomas didn't ask questions. He knew that whatever had brought her here wasn't something she could or would explain to a stranger in the middle of the night. So he let her be. He gave the horse a gentle pat, checked the barn doors again, and made sure everything was locked up tight. Before he left, he glanced at her once more. She had already pulled the heavier blanket around herself and laid back down in the hay. Within minutes, her eyes closed again, though not quite as tightly as before. When Thomas stepped out into the night again, the air was sharp and still. The ranch felt different now, not in a loud or dangerous way, but in a quiet, uncertain way, like a story had just begun, even if he didn't know the words yet. He walked back to his house, poured himself a cup of warm coffee, and sat by the small fire. He told himself that he'd let her rest for the night and figure things out in the morning. But he couldn't stop thinking about the look in her eyes, strong, guarded, but beneath all that, tired. He leaned back in his chair and listened to the sound of the wind brushing against the window. He was used to silence, but this silence carried something new, a sense that the world outside his small ranch was closer than he had thought, a reminder that life could change in a single, unexpected moment. Thomas didn't know who she was or why she had chosen his barn, but he knew that the land had a strange way of crossing people's paths when they least expected it, and somehow deep down he felt this was not a passing encounter. Something had shifted quietly in the rhythm of his simple life, something he couldn't yet name. As the fire burned low and the stars turned slowly overhead, Thomas drifted into a light sleep in his chair. Out in the barn, under the soft glow of the lantern and the smell of fresh hay, the young Apache woman slept too. Still a stranger, but no longer alone in the cold night. Morning came quietly, like it always did on Thomas Whitaker's ranch. The sun slowly climbed over the hills, spreading warm light across the dry earth. The sky was clear and soft blue, the kind of morning that usually made Thomas feel calm. But that morning didn't feel like any other. He stood on his porch holding a tin cup of coffee, staring toward the barn. He had hardly slept. All night his mind had wandered back to the woman lying in the hay. Normally he began his day by feeding the animals, checking the fences, and riding out to the fields. His life had a certain rhythm that never changed. But today the rhythm had a new beat. He didn't know who she was or where she came from, but he knew she hadn't appeared there for no reason. Out here in the wide land where neighbors lived miles apart, strangers didn't simply walk into your barn. There was always a story behind it. He took a deep breath, set down the cup, and walked toward the barn. The ground was still damp with morning dew. The smell of hay grew stronger as he got closer. Birds sang from the fence posts. It was peaceful on the outside, but Thomas felt a quiet storm of thoughts building inside him. He opened the barn door slowly. Light spilled in from behind him, brightening the corners that had been dark the night before. The woman was awake now. She sat against the wooden wall, the wool blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her dark hair fell loosely over her face. In the light of morning, Thomas could see more clearly. She had soft brown skin, strong cheekbones, and steady, sharp eyes. She didn't look frightened, but she didn't look at ease either. She looked like someone ready to run if she needed to. The horse shifted and snorted, but the woman didn't move. She watched Thomas carefully as he stepped inside. He raised his hand slightly the way he had the night before, showing he meant no harm. "Morning," he said softly, his voice calm. She didn't answer. She only looked at him, her hands holding the edges of the blanket like it was the only thing she trusted. Thomas pointed to the tin cup she had left on the floor. "Empty now." "More water?" he asked, though he didn't know if she understood. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes flickering to the cup. That small reaction told him she understood more than she let on. He nodded and went back to the house. A few minutes later, he returned with a wooden tray. On it was a cup of warm water, a small piece of bread, and an apple. Nothing fancy, just what he had in his kitchen. He placed the tray on the floor, not too close to her, giving her space. She hesitated for a long moment, then slowly reached forward and picked up the apple. She didn't eat fast. She took small, careful bites as if she wasn't used to being given something without asking. Thomas leaned against a post, arms folded loosely. He didn't speak. He knew too many words too early could scare someone away, so he let the quiet fill the barn. Only the sounds of birds, horses, and her soft chewing broke the silence. When she finished the bread, her shoulders dropped slightly. A tiny bit of the tension she carried seemed to melt away. Thomas cleared his throat gently. "You're welcome to rest here," he said slowly. For a little while. He wasn't sure why he said it. He had planned to ask her to leave as soon as the sun was up. But something about her tired face made those words come out instead. The woman didn't speak, but her eyes met his. It wasn't a smile, but something in that glance felt like understanding. She pulled the blanket tighter as if to make sure the moment was real. Thomas walked a few steps closer, but not too close. He pointed to himself and said, "Thomas." He then pointed at her, waiting. She stared at him, silent. He repeated softly, tapping his chest again. "Thomas." This time she seemed to understand. Her lips moved, and in a quiet, almost shy voice she said, "Ayasha." It was the first time he'd heard her voice. It was soft and steady, with an accent that rolled gently off her tongue. "Nice to meet you, Ayasha," he said with a small nod. She blinked slowly, as if weighing whether she could trust that moment. Thomas didn't ask her where she came from. He didn't ask why she had walked onto his land. He could tell those answers weren't ready to come out yet. Some stories needed time. He respected that. But his mind couldn't help but wonder. It wasn't easy to travel alone out here, especially for someone who looked tired and hurt. The nearest settlement was miles away. How far had she walked? How long had she been out there? The ranch had always been a quiet place, a world of its own. But now it felt different. The presence of one stranger had turned the familiar into something uncertain, but strangely alive. As the morning grew warmer, Thomas went about his chores. He fixed the gate near the corral, gathered feed for the cattle, and checked the water troughs. But every now and then his eyes flicked toward the barn. Ayasha sat in the same spot for a while, watching quietly. She seemed to be studying everything, the animals, the fences, the fields. Her gaze wasn't lost or confused. It was sharp, like she was learning his world one piece at a time. By midday, she slowly stood up, steadying herself against the wall. She looked stronger than she had the night before, though still tired. Thomas noticed her looking toward the open field. The way she moved wasn't aimless. She carried herself with quiet grace, even in worn clothes. When she stepped toward the barn door, he tensed just a little, wondering if she would disappear as suddenly as she had come. But she didn't run. She stepped outside slowly, blinking in the sunlight. The open land stretched out before her, golden grass, dusty trails, fences marking the edges of his ranch. She walked a few steps forward, stopped, and then turned her face to the wind. It lifted her hair slightly, brushing across her shoulders. For a moment she closed her eyes. Thomas couldn't help but think she looked like someone who had been holding her breath for a long time and was finally taking it in again. Thomas didn't follow her. He leaned on the fence near the barn and watched quietly. He didn't want to scare her away or make her feel trapped. She was still a stranger to him, and yet in a strange way her presence didn't feel threatening. It felt like a mystery slowly unfolding. She looked back at him once. Not a long stare, just a small glance. Then she walked a few steps closer, stopping at a comfortable distance. She didn't speak, but the look in her eyes carried something like a silent question. He didn't know what she wanted to ask, and she didn't have the words to ask it. But something about the way she looked at him told him she was trying to decide whether to trust him or keep her walls up. "I won't hurt you," Thomas said gently, though he wasn't sure how much she understood. She didn't answer, but she didn't turn away either. That felt like a small step forward. The sun rose higher, warming the air. Thomas thought about riding to town to tell the sheriff that a stranger was on his land. It was the kind of thing people were expected to do, but his gut told him not to. Not yet. He didn't see a threat in Ayesha. He saw someone who had clearly been through something, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt responsible for her well-being, at least for now. Later in the afternoon, Thomas went inside his house and came back with a clean shirt and a pair of soft shoes. They were too big for her, but better than nothing. When he handed them to her, she hesitated, unsure at first. Then she accepted them slowly. She disappeared behind the barn for a short while and returned wearing the shirt. It hung loosely on her shoulders, but it gave her warmth. She gave him a quiet, small nod. Not quite a smile, but a silent way of saying thank you. As the day drew on, Ayesha started to move around the barn more confidently. She even helped gather a few loose bundles of hay without being asked. Thomas didn't stop her. He simply let her be. It wasn't about chores. It was about letting her find her place in this quiet corner of the world, if only for a little while. Evening came softly, painting the sky with gold and pink. The wind settled again. Thomas sat on the porch just like the night before, but this time he wasn't alone in the quiet. He could see Ayesha sitting near the barn door, watching the horizon as the sun dipped lower. He thought about the many things he could ask her, where she came from, why she was alone, what she planned to do next. But he also understood that not every answer was meant to be forced. Sometimes stories had to rise slowly like the sun in the morning, one light at a time. The lanterns were lit again when the night fell. The stars spread wide above them. Thomas watched as Ayesha carefully returned to the barn, this time with a little less fear in her steps. She settled down in the hay with the blanket he had given her. Her shoulders no longer looked so tense. Her breathing was steady. Thomas stood at the barn door for a long moment, not saying anything. He felt something new stirring in the quiet night. Not danger, not worry, but a sense of unexpected connection. The ranch had always been a place of silence, but tonight the silence felt warmer. It was as if two people who didn't share a language were learning to listen to the same stillness. He walked back to the house, sat by the fire, and stared into the flames. Something had changed again, though it was still too quiet and new to name. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew this much. This was no ordinary meeting. Whatever story had begun the night before was only just starting to unfold. Outside, the wind brushed against the barn softly like a whisper. Inside, Ayesha closed her eyes, wrapped in warmth for the first time in a long while. And not far away, Thomas sat awake, feeling the weight of the unknown settle. The next few days on the ranch felt different from any other time Thomas could remember. The air was the same, the fields looked the same. The wind still moved softly across the land at night, but something had changed in the quiet rhythm of his life. It was Ayesha's presence. She moved quietly, always cautious, always aware of her surroundings, as if the world outside the ranch had taught her to be careful with every step. At first, Thomas wasn't sure how to act around her. He wasn't used to having anyone else there. For years, the only sounds he heard in the mornings were the creaking of wood, the gentle lowing of cattle, and the chirping of birds. But now there were small, soft sounds of her footsteps in the barn. There were moments when he'd look up from mending a fence and see her standing near the gate, watching the fields with thoughtful eyes. She didn't talk much. She didn't need to. Her silence had its own weight, its own story. Every morning, Thomas would place a little food on the table by the barn, bread, sometimes fruit, and warm water or milk. Ayesha never asked, but she always accepted quietly. The way she held the bread carefully, almost like it was something precious, told him more than words could. She was someone who had spent a long time surviving with very little. The first real change came on the third morning. Thomas was in the corral trying to fix a loose fence board. It was a simple job, but he could have used an extra hand to hold it steady. He didn't ask, but Ayesha, who had been standing nearby, walked over without a word. She placed her hands against the board, holding it still while he hammered the nails. Their eyes met only once, just a brief moment, but it said enough. It was quiet understanding. From then on, little by little, Ayasha began to help around the ranch. She fed the chickens in the morning, gathered small pieces of wood, and swept the barn floor clean with a quiet determination. She never asked for anything in return. She worked without expecting praise. Thomas noticed that she seemed more comfortable when her hands were busy, as if the work gave her a sense of safety she hadn't felt in a long time. Thomas didn't push her to speak, but sometimes when the wind was soft and the world felt less heavy, she would offer a word or two. Her English was limited, but she understood more than she could say. Some evenings, after they had both finished their work, they would sit outside the barn watching the sun fall behind the hills. Thomas would talk a little, not asking questions, just sharing small pieces of his life. He told her about his ranch, about how he built it with his own hands, about the early years when everything was hard but worth it. She listened quietly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. He learned something without her ever saying it. Ayasha liked silence. Not the heavy silence of fear, but the soft kind. The kind that comes when people share a space without needing to fill it with words. But even as their quiet bond grew, Thomas knew it wasn't simple. The world outside the ranch was not always kind. People talked. And a stranger appearing on a man's land, especially someone like Ayasha, would draw unwanted attention if anyone found out. He also sensed that she carried something inside her. Not just weariness, but a story that hadn't been told yet. One afternoon, while the sun was high and warm, Thomas was repairing a saddle in front of the house. He noticed Ayasha standing near the edge of the fence looking out at the open land. She wasn't just looking. She was staring far away, almost as if she could see something or someone out there. Her hands were folded tightly together. For the first time since she arrived, her face looked different. Not calm, not guarded. It carried something else. A quiet ache. Thomas didn't interrupt her. He just watched from a distance, trying to understand what she was feeling. After a while, she walked back slowly, but her steps were heavier than usual. That night, she didn't sit outside as she often did. She stayed in the barn, wrapped in her blanket, facing away from the door. Thomas sat on his porch looking at the stars and thought about her. He didn't know her past, but he knew pain when he saw it. He had felt it once too, years ago, when he lost someone he loved. He had chosen silence then, just as she was choosing it now. The next morning, Ayasha didn't eat much. She worked quietly but seemed far away in thought. Thomas decided to give her space, but inside a small worry grew. He didn't want her to disappear as suddenly as she had come. He had grown used to seeing her around, used to the sound of quiet footsteps in the barn, used to the soft presence of someone who didn't demand anything but gave something unspoken back. As the day passed, a soft wind rose, carrying the dry scent of the plains. Thomas saddled his horse to check the far fence line. Before he left, he found Ayasha near the corral. He didn't have to say much. He just looked at her and said softly, "I'll be back before dark." She nodded once, still quiet, but her eyes lingered on him a little longer than usual. That small look told him something. Maybe trust, maybe something else. When he returned in the late afternoon, she was still there. She had collected some firewood and had set it neatly by the barn. The simple act touched him more than he expected. She wasn't just passing through anymore. She was slowly leaving her presence in the little corners of his life. That evening, the sky turned golden, then deep pink. The air was calm. Thomas decided to sit by the barn instead of his porch. Ayasha was already sitting on the wooden step, her knees drawn up, her blanket draped over her shoulders. For a long time, they both just sat there looking at the horizon. The silence was full, not empty. Thomas picked up a small stick and began drawing shapes in the dirt. "Why here?" he asked softly, not expecting an answer. Ayasha looked at him. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't speak. But then slowly she said, "Safe." The word was simple, but it carried weight. She lowered her eyes again, pulling the blanket closer. That one word told him more than a long explanation could. She had come because she needed safety. Maybe from something, maybe from someone. But she had found a quiet corner of the world where no one was chasing her. Thomas didn't ask more. He didn't need to. He just nodded and looked back at the horizon. Over the next few evenings, their routine became something almost natural. She helped with the work. He made sure she had food and a warm place to sleep. And little by little, their silence began to feel like a language of its own. But beneath that quiet bond, a soft current of worry flowed through Thomas's mind. The outside world didn't stay still forever. A neighbor could pass by. Someone from town might visit. If anyone saw Ayasha, questions would come. And questions in a land like this could turn into problems quickly. One chilly evening, Thomas was fixing a lantern in the barn when Ayasha approached him. She hesitated, then pointed at the horse. "Ride?" she asked softly. Thomas paused. It was the first time she had asked him for anything. He nodded slowly. "Tomorrow," he said with a smile. "Morning." The next morning they rode together. She sat behind him on the horse as they moved slowly through the open field. Her hands rested lightly against his back. The wind brushed past them, warm and steady. For the first time, Thomas heard a small laugh escape her lips. Quiet and soft, but real. It was the kind of sound that carried hope, even if only a little. When they reached a small rise overlooking the valley, Thomas stopped the horse. Ayasha slid down carefully, stepping onto the golden grass. She looked around with wide eyes, taking in the endless sky, the distant hills, the quiet land. She lifted her arms slightly, as if feeling the wind against her skin was something she had missed for too long. Thomas watched her, not as a stranger anymore, but as someone who had slowly become a part of his days. Her presence was no longer a question mark. It was something that had quietly settled into the ranch like sunlight in the morning. As they rode back, Ayasha leaned a little closer, no longer holding distance. And Thomas, without saying anything, knew what it meant. She was learning to trust, and trust out here was a rare and fragile thing. That night, as the stars shone bright over the silent land, Thomas lay awake in his chair. He wasn't afraid. He was simply aware that something important was happening, something he couldn't quite name yet. A stranger had walked into his barn one cold night, and now she had walked quietly into his heart without trying to. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know how long this fragile peace would last. But he knew this. The world had grown less quiet in the best kind of way. Outside, Ayasha lay in the hay, wrapped in the blanket he had given her. Her breathing was calm. For the first time since arriving, she wasn't just resting. She was sleeping deeply, like someone who finally felt a little safe in the world. The following days passed with a quiet rhythm, yet there was an undercurrent of change that neither Thomas nor Ayasha could ignore. The mornings had grown warmer, but the night still carried a chill that crept through the walls of the barn and into the cabin. Thomas noticed small changes in Ayasha. She moved with more confidence, her steps less careful, her gaze lingering longer on the horizon rather than on the ground. Yet there was something deeper, something he could not yet name. A restlessness behind her eyes, a curiosity mingled with caution. Thomas, too, felt the subtle shift in himself. The solitude that had once comforted him now felt incomplete without her presence. Even when he was out on the fields tending to the fences or guiding the cattle, he found his thoughts drifting toward the barn, toward the woman who had arrived silently, almost by accident, into his quiet life. He could not help but wonder about her story, why she had traveled so far alone, what had made her come to this ranch in the first place. One morning, the tension in the air seemed heavier than usual. Thomas had been feeding the animals when he noticed Ayasha lingering at the edge of the corral. Her gaze was fixed on the distant hills. For a moment, she didn't move. Then, almost imperceptibly, she shook her head as if trying to shake off a thought. Thomas sensed that she wanted to say something but was unsure of the words. He approached her slowly, giving her space. "You can tell me," he said gently, "if you want to." She looked at him, and for a fleeting second, the walls she had built around herself seemed to quiver. Then she stepped back slightly, a hesitant gesture that spoke of both fear and trust. Thomas nodded, understanding the unspoken language of her hesitation. He didn't push. He knew that trust once built had to be respected, not forced. Instead, he offered a small smile and gestured toward the barn. "We can sit," he said softly. She followed, her movements careful but deliberate, as though she was testing the ground beneath her feet. They settled in the barn, the familiar smell of hay surrounding them. Thomas pulled a wooden chair close to hers, keeping a respectful distance, and watched as she wrapped her blanket around her shoulders. The sun filtered through the cracks in the walls, casting long golden beams across the floor. For a moment, silence held them together, not as strangers, but as companions in a fragile, shared space. Finally, Ayasha spoke. The words were few, hesitant, but deliberate. "Far," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas tilted his head, prompting her silently to continue. She gestured toward the horizon, her hands sweeping across the fields and hills beyond the ranch. "Walk, long," she added, her tone carrying a weight of memory, of journey, and of endurance. Thomas nodded slowly, understanding more from her gestures and expressions than the words themselves. She had traveled far, perhaps to escape something or to find something, and now she was here. The realization filled him with a quiet respect for her courage. She had come alone, walked for miles across an unfamiliar land, and arrived at his doorstep without complaint, without asking for anything beyond safety. The day unfolded with small gestures of connection. Thomas fetched water and bread, placing them gently before her. Ayasha accepted them, her hands steady, her movements confident. For the first time, she asked him a question in her broken English, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Name?" Thomas smiled and said his name again, pointing to himself. "Thomas." Then he pointed toward her. "Ayasha?" She nodded, confirming her name. The exchange was simple, but it carried a weight of significance. Names had meaning. They were acknowledgement, recognition, and the first step toward trust. Later in the afternoon, Thomas decided to take Ayasha to a quiet place he often visited when he needed peace. It was a small rise overlooking a hidden valley, a place where the wind moved softly through the grass and the horizon seemed endless. He helped her onto the horse behind him, just as he had done before, and they rode together in silence. The wind brushed past them, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant wildflowers. Ayasha held on, her fingers brushing lightly against his back. Thomas could feel her tension melting slowly, replaced by a tentative comfort. When they reached the valley, Thomas guided the horse to a gentle stop. Ayasha slid off, her boots touching the soft golden grass. She turned in a slow circle, taking in the vast openness of the valley. Her eyes sparkled with wonder, and for the first time Thomas heard her laughter. Not loud, not forced, but soft and genuine. It was a sound that seemed to carry hope, curiosity, and relief all at once. Thomas remained a few steps back, letting her explore the space, letting her enjoy this small taste of freedom. It was a moment of breakthrough, a turning point in their fragile connection. Ayasha's guard was lowering, and Thomas understood that trust, once nurtured, could bloom in even the most unlikely of places. They stayed in the valley for hours, walking slowly, talking in gestures and broken words, learning each other's rhythms. Thomas showed her a small stream where the water ran clear, teaching her how to fill her hands and drink without spilling. Ayasha laughed at her own clumsiness the first few times, but soon she managed with careful grace. Each small success was a quiet victory, and Thomas felt a deep satisfaction in sharing this part of his world with her. As the sun began to dip behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Thomas and Ayasha sat on a smooth rock overlooking the valley. The air had cooled, carrying a gentle breeze. Ayasha rested her head lightly against Thomas's shoulder, not in a way that demanded intimacy, but in a way that sought comfort, safety, and companionship. Thomas placed his hand gently on her back, respecting her space yet offering quiet reassurance. For the first time since she had arrived, Ayasha spoke in more than a word. "Home?" she asked, her voice soft, almost questioning. Thomas smiled, understanding exactly what she meant. "Yes," he said, pointing toward the ranch in the distance. "Home, safe." Her eyes shone, reflecting the colors of the sunset. She didn't speak again, but she didn't need to. The moment was complete. The journey, the fear, the weariness, all of it had led to this small, fragile peace. They sat together quietly, two souls who had found each other in a vast, quiet land, sharing warmth, trust, and understanding without the need for grand gestures or declarations. On the way back to the ranch, Ayasha remained close, her hand brushing lightly against Thomas's arm. The simple touch spoke of acknowledgement, of a bond forming stronger than either of them could yet name. Thomas felt a deep sense of contentment, realizing that she had chosen to stay, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The choice itself carried profound meaning. That night, as the stars spread wide and bright above the ranch, Thomas sat on the porch while Ayesha settled in the barn. But she didn't lie down immediately. Instead, she stepped outside briefly, taking in the night air. The wind lifted her hair gently and she closed her eyes, as if absorbing every detail of the quiet world around her. Thomas watched silently, feeling a connection deeper than words could express. Finally, she returned to the barn, laying herself in the hay with a blanket tucked around her. Her breathing was calm, steady, and free of the tension that had haunted her since she arrived. Thomas understood that the peak of their trust had been reached tonight. They had crossed the threshold from strangers to companions, from caution to a shared understanding. Thomas remained awake for a while longer, gazing at the stars and reflecting on the changes the past days had brought. Ayesha had entered his life quietly, almost imperceptibly, yet her presence had transformed the silence he had known for so long. The ranch, once a place of solitary routine, had become a shared world, a world of discovery, connection, and gentle companionship. He knew the days ahead would continue to test them in small ways. Communication would remain a challenge, and the world outside would still pose questions. But the breakthrough of this day, the laughter, the gestures of trust, the shared quiet moments had created a foundation strong enough to carry them forward. For Ayesha, the valley, the sunset, and the quiet companionship had shown her a kind of safety and peace she had not known for a long time. For Thomas, it had shown that even the most solitary life could be touched by connection and trust, if one had the patience and the heart to nurture it. And so, under the wide, starry sky of the Wild West, two lives intertwined quietly, building a bond of understanding and care, ready to face whatever the next days would bring. They had reached the peak of their silent journey, the moment of emotional clarity and trust, yet the story was far from over. The night stretched on, holding a sense of promise and hope, as the ranch, the valley, and the two companions beneath the stars settled into a calm, shared rhythm. The mornings that followed felt lighter, almost as if the sun rose with a brighter promise than it had before. Thomas Whitaker moved through his chores with a sense of calm he had not felt in years. The ranch still required the same work, feeding the animals, repairing fences, checking the water troughs. But now there was a quiet companionship that made each task feel easier. Ayesha had become a part of the rhythm of the ranch, not just a visitor but someone who belonged, someone whose presence softened the edges of Thomas's solitary life. Ayesha, too, had changed in small, visible ways. She no longer flinched at the sound of distant horses or the creak of the barn doors. Her movements had grown confident, her gaze steady. She smiled more, small and careful but genuine. Even the way she carried herself, once tense and cautious, now held a quiet grace that told Thomas she was beginning to trust not just him, but the world around her. The ranch had become a sanctuary for her, a place where she could breathe without fear. Each day, Thomas and Ayesha found new ways to communicate. Words were still limited, but gestures and glances had developed their own language. A nod, a hand extended, a gentle smile. These simple actions carried meaning stronger than anything spoken aloud. They learned each other's rhythms. He knew when she wanted quiet, when she needed space, and when she simply wanted to share a moment in silence. She learned the routines of the ranch, how to handle the animals carefully, how to gather water without spilling, how to move through the spaces of his world as if she had always belonged there. One morning, Thomas found her sitting on the porch steps, her eyes fixed on the distant hills. The wind played with her hair, and she looked almost like she had become a part of the landscape itself. He didn't speak right away. He simply walked over and sat beside her. For a long time, they watched the sun climb higher, the light spreading over the land, casting golden hues across the fields and barns. Finally, Ayesha spoke in the soft, broken English she was gradually learning. "Thank Thomas," she said. There was a quiet weight to her words, not of obligation but of genuine gratitude. Thomas nodded, his heart warming. "You're welcome, Ayesha," he said. He didn't need to say more. The bond they had forged was already clear in the quiet understanding between them. The days passed into weeks, each one reinforcing the small but significant changes in their lives. Thomas noticed that Ayesha began to laugh more freely, sometimes at small things. A bird hopping near the fence, a horse playing in the field, or even his own clumsy attempts at humor. Her laughter was like sunlight breaking through clouds, a reminder that even in the quiet, sometimes lonely life of the ranch, joy could be found. Ayasha, too, learned to share small stories of her life. Not full tales because the past was still heavy and she spoke cautiously, but fragments, memories of her family, the lands she had traveled, and the small joys she had experienced. Thomas listened carefully, never interrupting, always allowing her words to unfold in her own time. And in these moments, a quiet respect grew between them, a respect for her strength, for her courage, for the resilience that had brought her to his doorstep in the first place. Evenings became their time to reflect and share. They would sit outside the barn watching the sun dip behind the hills, the sky turning shades of pink, orange, and purple. The wind was soft, the air carrying the faint scent of grass and hay. Sometimes they would speak in gestures, sometimes in broken sentences, but always with understanding. Thomas found that he no longer felt alone in the world he had built. Ayasha had become a companion, a presence that filled the spaces of his life with warmth and quiet joy. One particular evening stood out. The sky was painted with the deepest shades of orange and violet, and the air was cool against their skin. Ayasha had spent the day helping in the barn, and now she sat beside Thomas on the porch steps, her blanket wrapped snugly around her shoulders. She leaned slightly against him, not in dependence, but in trust. For a long moment, they watched the stars appear one by one, twinkling faintly above the quiet land. Thomas thought about the journey that had brought her here, the long, uncertain walk, the fear she must have carried, the courage it took to arrive at a stranger's ranch and place her trust in him. He realized then that her presence had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. His world, once simple and solitary, had gained depth, warmth, and a new sense of purpose. He had become more attentive, more patient, more aware of the small, quiet joys of life because of her. Ayasha turned her head toward him, her dark eyes reflecting the fading light. She spoke softly, almost shyly. "Home, here?" Thomas smiled and nodded. "Yes," he said. "Safe. Here." She leaned back slightly, resting her head against the post behind her, a gentle sigh escaping her lips. It was a sigh of relief, of comfort, and perhaps for the first time in a long while a sigh of peace. Days turned into weeks, and the bond between them continued to grow. Ayasha took part in the daily life of the ranch more fully, learning how to care for the animals, how to mend fences, how to tend to the land. Thomas in turn found himself looking forward to her presence, to the soft conversations, the shared silences, the small gestures that carried meaning. Their lives had intertwined quietly, naturally without force or expectation, and it had created a sense of balance neither had anticipated. One afternoon, as they worked together in the barn, Ayasha paused and looked at him with a small smile. She pointed to the hay and then to herself and then back at him. Thomas raised an eyebrow, unsure of her intent. She giggled softly and began stacking the hay in a different way than he had shown her, demonstrating initiative, creativity, and independence. Thomas laughed quietly, realizing that she was no longer merely following his guidance but adding her own touch to the life of the ranch. It was a small but meaningful sign of her comfort, her growing confidence, and her sense of belonging. That evening, Thomas prepared a small meal and brought it to the barn. They ate quietly, the soft light of a lantern illuminating their faces. Words were few, but each one carried weight. They spoke of small things, of the weather, of the animals, of plans for the coming days. But underneath it all, there was an unspoken understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had shared and the bond they had formed. As the night deepened, Thomas stepped outside the barn for a moment, looking up at the sky. The stars stretched endlessly above, each one a silent witness to the unfolding story of trust, courage, and connection. He thought of the night she had first appeared in his barn, shivering and wary, and of the quiet evenings they had shared since. The contrast was remarkable. What had begun as a chance encounter had grown into something meaningful, something lasting, something that neither of them could have predicted. Ayasha emerged from the barn quietly, carrying her blanket. She sat beside him, her eyes reflecting the light of the stars. For a long while they simply sat together, the silence comfortable, the world around them calm. Then she spoke softly and clearly. "Thank Thomas?" He nodded, understanding the depth of her gratitude without her needing to say more. The words were simple, but the meaning was profound. Time passed and the seasons began to change. The air grew cooler, the nights longer, and the first hints of winter crept across the plains. Yet the bond between Thomas and Ayesha remained steady, unwavering. They had built something rare and precious, a quiet companionship, a shared understanding, a trust that had grown stronger with each passing day. In the stillness of one evening, Thomas reflected on the lessons he had learned from her presence. Life, he realized, was not meant to be lived alone. It was meant to be shared even in small, quiet ways. The courage to trust, the patience to wait, the willingness to open one's heart, these were the true measures of strength. Ayesha had taught him all of that without ever intending to. Ayesha, too, had learned from Thomas. She had discovered that it was possible to find safety, kindness, and companionship even in a world that often seemed harsh and unwelcoming. She had learned that trust could grow slowly and quietly, and that hearts could connect without words or grand gestures. She had found a home not just in the barn, not just on the ranch, but in the quiet space between them, where understanding and care flourished naturally. As winter settled over the land, the ranch stood quietly under a blanket of frost. The animals huddled together for warmth, and the fields glistened in the morning sun. Thomas and Ayesha continued their daily routines, their lives intertwined in ways that brought comfort and joy. The world outside remained vast and unpredictable, but within the borders of the ranch a sense of peace reigned. One night, as they sat outside the barn watching the stars, Thomas realized that the story of that first night, the night she had appeared in his barn, would remain with him forever. It was a story of chance, of courage, and of the quiet power of human connection. Ayesha had walked into his life unexpectedly, and in doing so had changed it forever. The future remained uncertain, as it always does. But for the first time, Thomas felt a quiet confidence that no matter what came, they would face it together, not as strangers, not as isolated souls, but as companions, friends, and allies in the simple, beautiful rhythm of life on the ranch. Ayesha rested her head lightly against his shoulder, the lantern casting a soft glow around them.